Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world so perfumed with secrecy, so saturated with moonlight and muslin, that it might just put you to sleep or haunt your dreams. You lie on a velvet floor cushion, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. There's a low hum, maybe a sitar in the distance, maybe just the wind slipping past lattice windows. Candles flicker behind silk screens. You're inside the private quarters of a Mughal palace, where love was power and passion could redraw the lines of an empire. And yes, you're barefoot, because in this story, even your toes aren't allowed to make noise. This isn't just about royalty, war, or shiny domes. This is about the affairs that shaped the Mughal Empire, not just pillow talk, but politics wrapped in poetry, betrayals written in eyeliner, and empires moved by longing. You probably won't survive this in real life. Most of them didn't. But that's okay, you're just here to listen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere distant or somewhere cozy, post your location and local time in the comments. I always read them, and it's oddly soothing knowing who else is drifting off with you tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the pale twilight of Kabul in 1504. There's a rustle in the orchard, pomegranate trees heavy with fruit, their petals falling like tiny red secrets on the dewy grass. The man you're following wears a turban loosely tied, as if he put it on without looking. He stops by a bench carved into the hillside, overlooking a stream that gurgles softly, unbothered by the empire rising slowly around it. This is Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, a warrior, a poet, a lover. And tonight, he's not thinking about warfare or fortresses. He's remembering a boy. Yes, a boy. In Babur's own memoir, the Baburnama, he writes about Babur Barlas, a younger man whose beauty unraveled him entirely. I had never seen anyone so beautiful, he admits, without euphemism or excuse. He writes of feeling dizzy when the boy passed, of being overwhelmed by shyness, of composing verses he dared not speak aloud. My eyes were charmed, he confesses. This wasn't a scandal at court, it was an open wound in his writing, but also a political risk, because desire wasn't private. Not for emperors. Historians still argue whether Babur's confession was bravery or distraction. Was it honesty in the style of Persian poetry? Or was it evidence of something deeper, some internal conflict he couldn't resolve? You picture him lying awake, palms sweaty, composing verses instead of war plans. Imagine an emperor-founder of a dynasty unable to confess a crush. The symmetry of it is quietly tragic. You sip the thought like rose tea, sweet, strange, lingering. There's something disarming about Babur's voice. Centuries later, you'd expect a military man to be all blood and campaign maps. But in his garden, surrounded by verses scratched into stone, he's just a boy with too many feelings and no Instagram account to vent on. And let's be honest, if he'd had a Finsta, those poems would have been up there with teary-eyed selfies. You chuckle, imagining Babur doom-scrolling poetry at 2 a.m., refreshing for likes from ghost followers. And there's more. You learn that gardens weren't just places of peace for the Mughals. They were metaphors for order, fertility, control. Building one was like composing a verse. Tending one was like taming a kingdom. So when Babur designs his first gardens in India after conquering the hot chaos of Hindustan, it's not just landscaping. It's therapy, maybe even foreplay, if you squint. One fringe detail. Mughal nobles obsessed over matching fragrances to moods. That orchard in Kabul might have been soaked in distilled oils, rose for melancholy, jasmine for courage, sandalwood for clarity. You inhale deeply, even though it's imaginary. Still works. But the emotional weight clings. Because Babur's story isn't just about longing. It's about never quite getting what you want. He spent his life trying to return to a homeland he lost, chasing victory like it could replace a person. Or maybe a feeling. He founded an empire, but part of him stayed in that Kabul orchard, writing poems about a boy he barely spoke to, and you, lying there with your eyes heavy, might wonder, can a dynasty really begin with a crush? A man distracted, mid-campaign by his own heart? Maybe it's not such a stretch. Power has always moved on strange currents, desire among the strongest. And in Babur's case, love wasn't just a whisper in the dark. It was a footnote in the founding of an empire. A blushing footnote, sure, but real. Etched into history like initials in wet stone. You shift slightly, the blanket rustling like leaves. Somewhere in the story, the orchard faded into night. The boy disappeared, and Babur became emperor. But maybe, just maybe, part of him stayed sitting on that hillside, heart pounding, wondering if Babur Barlas ever noticed. You're standing now in the middle of a battlefield, but there's no clanging of swords, no war cries. Just the faint rustle of silk under armor, and the smell of crushed tulsi beneath war horses. You see Humayun Babur's son, heir to a fragile dream, walking alone through the smoldering aftermath of one more chaotic campaign. His boots are muddy, his eyes bloodshot, and in one trembling hand, he holds not a sword, but a vial of opium. This isn't how you expected to meet an emperor, is it? The historians like to argue about Humayun. Some call him weak, others call him a mystic trapped in a general's life. But no one doubts he was a man caught between two desires, the pressure to rule and the pull of oblivion. And in the middle of that tug of war was a woman whose name history forgets, but whose influence lingers like the smoke after a cannon fire. They met, according to court whispers, on a rooftop. It was late, the stars were clear, and she was reading poetry aloud, but mostly to herself. Her voice, they say, was like water poured from a clay jug, low, rhythmic, a little too beautiful for safety. Humayun, barely king then, wandered up there in one of his nocturnal opium hazes. He heard her reading and didn't interrupt. Just stood there, swaying slightly, as she finished the line. She turned, startled, and he smiled like a boy caught sneaking a cookie. What followed was not scandal, but something worse for the Mughal. Court. Intimacy. She was not nobility. She was not even Persian. She was a Hindu musician's daughter, educated beyond her caste, clever enough to play dumb when it suited her. He visited her rooftop again, and again. Always at night, always. Alone, until the court noticed. They always notice. The affair wasn't just gossip fodder, it was a diplomatic disaster in the making. Marriage in Mughal times was a chess move. Wives were treaties, concubines were leverage. Humayun, moon-drunk and poetic, was breaking the rules, not with a rival princess, not with a Rajput ally, but with a girl who played the veena like it could rewrite fate. Historians still argue whether she ever bore him a child, or whether she died young, poisoned by jealous rivals. The records blur, and maybe that's part of the heartbreak. She wasn't important enough to be remembered properly. But in Humayun's later letters, tucked between philosophical ramblings and astrological predictions, there are phrases that feel like grief. One reads, "The stars can be read, but not rewritten." Another, "The veena sounds fainter now." He turned more fully to his drugs after that. Court chroniclers say he became erratic, floating between lucidity and oblivion. He once ordered a painting of her veiled barefoot, holding a book of Rumi's verses. When asked why the face was turned away, he only said, "Because some memories are not for sharing." And you, comfortably wrapped in your blanket, might feel a pang of strange recognition. That aching space where love lives quietly, unwelcome among politics and power. But there's another side to this story, too, one that rarely makes it into bedtime history. Humayun wasn't just a lovesick dreamer. He was also a man trained in esoteric astrology, deeply superstitious, convinced that stars could be courted like women, and love could be negotiated through ritual. That same opium haze didn't just seduce him into laziness. It led him to experiment with strange spiritual practices. One fringe tidbit: he once hosted an all-night summit between court astronomers and Sufi mystics to determine whether Venus was jealous of Jupiter or merely misunderstood. He had the entire meeting painted, complete with planets personified as bejeweled dancers. It hangs now in a museum, misattributed to another era. You chuckle at the thought of a royal seance just to appease the feelings of celestial bodies. The man was dramatic, the empire less amused. Still, he kept ruling badly, inconsistently, but with surprising resilience. Every time his enemies thought him dead or exiled for good, he floated back like a ghost wrapped in brocade. Once, while fleeing a siege, he crossed the desert with only a tattered cloak, a handful of loyalists, and a dream of his lost rooftop girl. Or maybe it was just the opium talking. You'll never know for sure. That's the trick with Humayun. He keeps slipping through your fingers. Not quite here, not quite gone. Like smoke. And yet, against all odds, he survived long enough to father Akbar, the great, the pragmatic, the visionary. But that's another story. For now, you lie there in the twilight of Humayun's reign, half seduced by his melancholy, wondering whether he truly loved her, or whether she was just another phantom conjured from grief and powder. The answer, like the stars, glimmers just out of reach. You exhale. The vina fades. You're drifting now down the marble corridors of the Agra Palace, trailing your fingers along walls so smooth they feel like chilled milk. The air is heavy with rosewater and something else in scents, perhaps, or the breath of secrets that have nowhere else to go. Through a carved archway, you catch a glimpse of Akbar, not the stern old emperor on horseback, but a young man barely 20, standing in the shade of a banyan tree, staring out over the palace gardens like he's waiting for the world to introduce itself. It hasn't yet. He's newly enthroned, untested, unsure of how to hold a sword without looking theatrical. His court is already plotting, his generals already whispering. But right now, he's thinking about a woman he hasn't met, yet one who will soon become his most valuable political strategy, and the first crack in his otherwise unshakable armor. Her name is Harka Bai, daughter of a Rajput king, a Hindu princess. She arrives not as a prisoner of war, but as an offering of peace. Akbar, clever even then, knows the significance. Marrying her won't just bring an alliance, it will be a symbolic merging of two great traditions. But here's the twist. He doesn't just marry her for politics. He falls for her. Deeply, inconveniently, and against the tight grain of royal expectations. Their story becomes the blueprint for one of the strangest political maneuvers in Mughal history. The love-based empire. You imagine their first meeting, awkward, quiet, loaded with unspoken danger. She stands tall, veiled but unafraid. He speaks slowly, choosing Persian poetry over military boasts. There's a silence between them, but it isn't empty. It's full of calculation, yes, but also curiosity. Historians still debate whether Harka Bai wielded real influence or was simply a well-treated ornament in Akbar's sprawling harem. Some say she advised him directly, especially on matters involving Rajput states. Others argue her power was softer, subtler, embedded in rituals, loyalties, and the son she would eventually give him, Prince Salim. And the harem, oh the harem. You're guided now through the labyrinth of Akbar's Zenana, where more than 5,000 women reside, not imprisoned, but arranged like living scrolls in a library of diplomacy. Each one a whisper from a different province, a thread in the empire's vast political fabric. Contrary to popular myth, Akbar didn't simply collect women. He assembled a council of wives and concubines whose backgrounds gave him leverage over distant kingdoms. But among them, Harka Bai held a unique place. Not because she was the most beautiful, though poets insist she glowed like gold, but because she was the first to bring her own god with her, unapologetically. She didn't convert. Akbar didn't force her. Instead, he visited her temple chamber barefoot, lit incense with trembling hands, and listened. That moment, the Muslim emperor worshipping silently at his Hindu wife's shrine sent tremors through the court. It also marked the birth of his most radical policy, Sulh-e-Kul, or peace with all, a philosophy that would define his reign and which, historians still argue, may have stemmed less from abstract tolerance and more from this very marriage. Imagine that, a royal romance not just shaping court fashion, but national policy. That's love with consequences. Now you walk with Akbar at night, past the mirrored fountains and parrot cages. As he composes questions for the scholars he will soon gather into his Ibadat Khana, the house of worship. He wants debate. He wants contradiction. He wants, perhaps unwisely, to blend Sufism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and even Christianity into a new spiritual alloy. Why? Because love has made him curious, or because he's trying to impress a woman who refused to renounce her gods. You smile. You've seen that look before. The slightly deranged optimism of a man in over his head, but enjoying the swim. One curious tidbit from this era. Akbar allegedly commissioned a perfume that mixed sacred sandalwood with ashes from multiple religious altars, temple, mosque, fire shrine. He wore it during debates to level the senses, as he put it. Whether this was true or court flattery, we'll never know. But you can almost smell its smoky floral, slightly heretical. And let's not forget the other women. While Harkabai held his heart, others held pieces of his intellect, his humor, his restlessness. Among them was a Persian philosopher's daughter, reputedly so brilliant that Akbar would delay court just to finish a conversation with her. Another was a dancer from Bengal whose movements were said to imitate the orbits of planets. He gave her a necklace inscribed with astrological charts, and she wore it like armor. None of them ruled alone, but all of them contributed to a climate of ideas, emotions, and yes, desire, that turned Akbar's court into something more than an imperial machine. It became an organism strange, seductive, impossible to replicate, and yet beneath the tolerance, the poetry, and the scented politics, there's still the man. Akbar, the insomniac. Akbar, the compulsive planner. Akbar, who wandered his palace barefoot at night, tracing stars on the ceilings, wondering if peace was ever truly possible, or if he had merely fallen for a mirage. The empire, meanwhile, expanded. Armies marched. Cities blossomed. But you stay here, in the quiet corners, where letters were written in secret, where prayers were shared between lovers, where a Hindu queen taught a Muslim emperor how to kneel. Without surrendering, the moon has risen higher now, casting silver on every dome. Somewhere, a parrot mutters a fragment of Sanskrit, learned by accident from temple chants. You rest your head against the imaginary stone wall and close your eyes. In this chapter of history, seduction wasn't scandal, it was statecraft. And love, as it turns out, can sometimes conquer more than war ever could. You're tiptoeing through a courtyard soaked in moonlight, where whispers curl like smoke around carved stone pillars. A faint breeze lifts the edge of a curtain, and behind it, you see her. She sits cross-legged on a cold marble floor, head bowed, hands steady as they sift through a chest of letters sealed in silk ribbon. Her fingers pause on one envelope, worn and fraying at the edges. She doesn't open it. She just holds it, as if the memory is louder than the words. This is Hamida Banu Begum, the widow, the mother, the invisible architect of dynastic resurrection. And tonight, you're about to learn that Mughal power didn't just pass from father to son. It moved through the pulse of a woman who grieved quietly and planned louder. You've been told history is a story of kings, but that's just because women like Hamida knew how to stay one step behind the curtain and 5 steps ahead of everyone else. You rewind the scene. Picture her at 15, married off to the opium-dreaming Humayun in a ceremony that felt more like a peace treaty than a romance. She didn't love him. Not then. Maybe not ever in the way ballads pretend. But she respected him, and perhaps more importantly, she understood him. When Humayun lost his kingdom, fled barefoot across deserts, and nearly died a dozen poetic deaths, Hamida followed. Pregnant, starving, but unshakably poised. Historians still debate whether her loyalty was born of duty or strategy. Some call it devotion. Others, survival instinct, sharpened to a blade in exile. She gave birth to a boy Salim's father, the future Akbar, in a fortress so bleak even the midwives wept. There were no royal robes, no golden cradles. Just cold stone, cold nights, and the breath of a dynasty teetering on the edge of extinction. You can almost hear the silence that followed that birth, broken only by a mother's heartbeat and the flicker of a prayer whispered not to a god, but to fate itself. That moment alone, invisible, mattered more than any coronation, because without her grit, there would be no Akbar, no empire, just a memory of what could have been, years past. Battles lost, empires fractured, and yet Hamida never stopped maneuvering. She became a master of soft power, disguising influence as kindness, cloaking diplomacy in lullabies. When Humayun finally stumbled back into Delhi with the help of Persian allies, she stood at his side like a ghost come to collect her due. But victory didn't last long. Within a year, he was dead, fallen down a staircase while carrying books, because irony doesn't care about dynasties. That left young Akbar on the throne at 13, and Hamida? She became the real ruler, whether the court acknowledged it or not. But here's the twist that history class never taught you. Hamida Banu Begum didn't just protect her son. She protected the idea of the empire itself, like a flame in a sandstorm. She negotiated with generals, bribed governors, whispered warnings into the ears of reluctant allies. She spoke rarely in court, but when she did, men listened. Not because they were afraid of her power, but because they never quite figured out how much of it she actually had. It was like trying to measure perfume in the air. You can't, but you know it's there. One fringe tidbit? She once rewrote a royal speech to include a line about mercy, slipped it onto the podium minutes before Akbar was to speak, and then stood beside him, eyes lowered, as if the words had been his all along. The audience wept. He never noticed. And while she moved chess pieces in public, in private, her heart carried 1,000 unsent letters. Rumors swirled of a Persian scholar she had once loved, before the marriage, before the exile. A man whose poetry mirrored her own unspoken aches. Some say she received one final note from him, long after they had both aged out of possibility. A simple verse, "I dreamed you in saffron, walking through snow." She never replied. But she wore saffron robes every spring until the year she died. Even as Akbar rose to fame, expanded the empire, and filled history books with his deeds, he continued to rely on her counsel. She was his mother, yes, but also his mirror. When he faced rebellions, she reminded him of kindness. When he slipped into arrogance, she reminded him of loss. And when he considered war, she reminded him of exile. It wasn't maternal smothering. It was psychological architecture. And if you listen closely, you could almost hear her voice behind the throne, steady, careful, always one word ahead of disaster. Historians still argue whether she was truly the power behind the throne, or merely a strong maternal presence. But here's something even scholars can't deny. In her lifetime, she outlived most of her enemies, outmaneuvered her rivals, and never once lost the quiet composure that made her unforgettable. Even in mourning, she was statuesque. When Akbar ordered a memorial built for her, he requested that her eyes be carved looking slightly down, not out of submission, but contemplation. And you, cozy now under your blanket, might find yourself wondering how many Hamidas you've never read about women who didn't wear crowns, but carried kingdoms in their arms, who wrote no manifestos, but changed history between lullabies and letters. This isn't romantic fluff. This is empire-level strategy disguised as maternal instinct. And it's precisely the kind of story you only hear when the lights are low, and the world is quiet enough to let whispers in. Back in that moonlit courtyard, she's still holding that frayed letter. She tucks it back into the chest, ties the ribbon without haste, and stands. Her steps echo against the marble, softer than a sigh, louder than a scream. The empire hums on, oblivious. But she knows. She always knew. You slip now into the hush of a private chamber, where the air tastes of cardamom and secrets, and the silk curtains sway like they're listening. The light is soft, filtered through yali screens carved so intricately that the sun seems shy about coming in. You're inside Akbar's harem, not the lascivious fantasy Western travelers like to imagine, but something stranger, more complex, and far more powerful. There are no lounging concubines feeding him grapes. Instead, you find a living map of the empire, over 5,000 women, each representing a different region, religion, or political arrangement, breathing, sleeping, and maneuvering beneath the same domed ceiling. It's not a brothel. It's a senate chamber made of perfume and glances. The women aren't just company. They are strategy incarnate. Marriages to Rajput princesses, Persian noblewomen, Uzbek allies. A political jigsaw puzzle that, when completed, held the empire together tighter than any fortress wall. Akbar, pragmatic to the bone, used the harem as a kind of diplomacy vault, each wife an insurance policy against revolt, each concubine a token of submission, each child a possible future alliance. You imagine trying to remember 5,000 names, or worse 5,000 moods. A modern emperor might struggle managing 2 group chats. Akbar managed an emotional parliament of women, and mostly without getting stabbed. That's something. But make no mistake, this wasn't just about politics. There was seduction too. Gentle, strategic, and often mutual. And one woman, more than any other, made the system not just tolerable but spectacular. She wasn't the most beautiful. She wasn't royal by birth. But her name would one day become synonymous with love and power so intertwined that history still can't quite separate them. Nur Jahan. But we're not there yet. First, you meet the prototype. She arrived at the harem anonymously, a gift from a Persian merchant to Akbar's court. That alone was unusual. Most women entered through marriage treaties or noble recommendation. She came with silk scrolls of poetry and a reputation for astrology. Her name was Meher-Unissa, sun among women. But no one used it then. She was just another veiled girl in the crowded harem. Beautiful, yes, but not extraordinary. Until she started talking. Or rather, until Akbar heard her arguing with one of his wives about the relative merit of Rumi versus Hafez. A scribe happened to be nearby, copying inventory records, and later mentioned the debate to Akbar as a curious anecdote. The emperor paused, asked for her name, and 2 days later invited her to dine with him, alone. That dinner changed everything. Akbar, known for his insatiable curiosity and love of good conversation, found her intellect as compelling as her eyes. They didn't talk about love. They talked about the stars, the geometry of Mughal gardens, and the logic of ethics. She challenged him, not rudely, not defiantly, just with enough precision to suggest she wasn't trying to win, just trying to be heard. He liked that, so he summoned her again, and again. Soon, she wasn't just another woman in the harem. She was the unofficial tutor to several royal children. She was consulted on state calendars, on auspicious dates for travel, even on the names of military campaigns. Historians still argue whether she and Akbar ever became lovers. Some insist she was only ever a trusted advisor. Others say there were nights when the emperor delayed court for hours just to sit by her side, while she played the sitar and recited verses from memory. Either way, her rise was undeniable. She never held a formal title. She never gave birth to a royal heir. And yet, within a year, she had a staff of 15 and her own rose garden inside the harem complex. That's not affection. That's influence. And here's where it gets really interesting. She started mentoring other women in the harem, teaching them Persian, music, and even politics. The harem, once a quiet holding pen for alliances, began to hum with debates. Imagine a TED Talk held. In silks and anklets, one fringe tidbit. She organized an anonymous essay competition among the wives, challenging them to write on the nature of loyalty in kings. The winning entry, ironically, was attributed to a woman rumored to be having an affair with a visiting Sufi scholar. The point wasn't the scandal, it was the dialogue. Akbar began quoting the essays in council meetings, pretending they came from court philosophers. Nobody questioned him. That's the part that lingers. This was power, real, invisible, feminine, and deeply strategic. While generals argued over troop movement, the women of Akbar's harem were quietly shaping the emperor's mind, his language, even his sense of morality. And Meherunissa? She stayed just visible enough to remain relevant, and just elusive. Enough to avoid being labeled a threat. No dramatic outbursts. No jealous rivals. Just poetry, music, and influence soaked in sandalwood. And yet, as you lie there, half lulled by the rhythm of this quiet rebellion, you feel the ache of anonymity. For all her influence, Meherunissa's name disappears from records after Akbar's death. Did she retire to a private villa? Did she enter mourning? Or was she removed by a nervous court eager to erase the fingerprints of a woman they couldn't control? Historians shrug. The files grow thin. But somewhere in the palace archives, a note in Akbar's handwriting remains. She brought wisdom. Where I expected silence, a small sentence. A big ghost. You close your eyes and imagine the harem not as a prison, but as a university, a council, a fragrant engine of empire. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that seduction isn't always physical. Sometimes it's intellectual. Sometimes it smells like jasmine and sounds like a philosophy debate held after midnight. Sometimes it reshapes an emperor's very idea of power. Outside, the parrot squawks again. The guards yawn, and the empire turns over in its sleep. Arrive now in a sun-drenched courtyard where a group of foreign men in heavy robes are sweating politely into their cassocks. They dab their foreheads with lace-edged handkerchiefs and pretend not to notice that their silk shoes are sinking into the warm sandstone. At the center of the courtyard sits Emperor Akbar, cross-legged, unbothered, sipping spiced buttermilk like he has all the time in the world. He's listening to someone read aloud from the Gospel of Matthew in Portuguese accented Persian. And you, watching from the shadow of a flowering neem tree, realize you've stumbled into something far stranger than diplomacy. You've stumbled into a flirtation between empires, a theological tete-a-tete, so intimate it could pass for seduction. Because these men are Jesuits sent from Goa, and Akbar isn't just tolerating them. He's teasing them, feeding them fruit, and asking questions so loaded they could explode a church council. Let's back up. In 1580, when Akbar invited Jesuit priests to his court, it wasn't out of religious desperation. He didn't need saving. He wanted stimulation. He was, as always, curious about God, about politics, about whether truth could be discovered through debate or must be received through dogma. The Jesuits arrived in full expectation of a royal conversion. They brought gifts, icons, and long, rehearsed sermons. What they got instead was a series of very odd, very charming conversations that left them flustered and faintly exhilarated. Akbar asked them about the virgin birth over dinner. He asked whether Jesus ever laughed. He asked what hell smelled like and whether angels got jealous. He wasn't mocking them. He was enjoying himself. He even commissioned a painting of the Madonna and Child to hang next to portraits of Hindu deities and Sufi saints. This wasn't blasphemy. It was foreplay for his spiritual philosophy, which was slowly, gingerly, beginning to take shape. Historians still argue whether Akbar was genuinely moved by Christian theology or simply fascinated by its strangeness. Some say he flirted with Christianity the way he flirted with poetry, passionately, temporarily, and without ever intending to marry. Others believe he saw in Christ not just a prophet, but a model of tolerance and reform that matched his own imperial project. One Jesuit priest, in his letters, described Akbar as a man who desires God, but not as a beggar, rather as a host at his own feast. You smile. That sounds exactly like him, and yet, beneath the polished charm and philosophical hospitality, something more personal flickered. You see, Akbar didn't just invite the Jesuits to speak. He invited them to stay, to walk in his gardens, to attend harem banquets where women, veiled but curious, asked them about Mary Magdalene and whether paradise allowed pets. One fringe tidbit: a letter survives in which a Jesuit describes being asked by a Mughal princess whether angels fell in love. He dodged the question. She sent him a mango the next day. That was diplomacy, Mughal style. But here's where it gets even more delicious. Akbar, with the gentle stubbornness of a man who always finishes the book, decided to create his own religion. Not quite Islam, not quite Hinduism, not quite Christianity. Something new, something his. He called it Din-i-Ilahi, the faith of the divine. It had no scripture, no clergy, no demand for conversion. Just a few ethics and rituals, and a deep belief that truth was like a prism, many-colored, many-faced, never quite still. The Jesuits were horrified. This wasn't the conversion they dreamed of. This was theological jazz. They wrote home in despair. He listens, one wrote, but he does not believe. Perhaps they missed the point. Belief, for Akbar, was never about surrender. It was about curiosity held sacred. You, reclining now under the flowering tree, begin to see the deeper structure of this seduction. Akbar wasn't trying to offend anyone. He was trying to love everyone intellectually, spiritually, politically. The Jesuits, for all their discomfort, stayed longer than expected. They taught, they translated, they dined. And when they left, Akbar gave them embroidered robes and boxes of saffron and a farewell speech, so gracious it made them cry. They hadn't converted the emperor, but he had, in his way, converted them into admirers, maybe even friends. And what about his wives? The harem, surprisingly, welcomed the theological circus with open arms. Akbar encouraged debate among them, too. He built an area near the Zenana for religious study, where women could learn side by side from Hindu, Muslim, Jain, and even Christian tutors. Imagine it, a Mughal princess reciting Christian catechism in Urdu, just to see if it sounded truer. Another writing Sanskrit hymns while wearing Islamic calligraphy as jewelry. That wasn't confusion. That was curiosity with bangles. One night, Akbar asked one of the Jesuits whether women were allowed to preach in Christian churches. When told no, he simply nodded and said, "That is unfortunate. They speak very well here." That quiet moment, a shrug, a nod, a compliment, carries more weight than most royal decrees. You realize the emperor didn't want everyone to believe the same thing. He wanted them to talk, to argue, to flirt with belief until something real emerged. The moon is high now, casting quiet halos over the marble. Somewhere, a Jesuit is lying, awake in his guest chamber, torn between doctrinal loyalty and admiration for an emperor who listens too well. Somewhere else, a Mughal scribe is copying verses from St. Paul into a calligraphy scroll bordered with lotus flowers. You shift under your blanket. The thought lingers. What if seduction, in this empire, wasn't about bodies, but about ideas? What if the heart of the Mughal court wasn't lust or ambition, but a strange, sincere hunger for beauty in all its forms. You close your eyes, and the courtyard dissolves. The tree remains. So does the breeze. You're walking now through a hallway of shadows, where the light barely dares to touch the floor, and even your breathing seems too loud. This part of the palace feels different, quieter, older, as if the stones themselves are holding their breath. Ahead, behind a half-open carved door, you see her. Seated by an open window, head tilted toward the wind, a candle flickering beside her untouched tea. Her fingers trace lines in the dust on the windowsill symbols. You almost recognize. This is Jahanara Begum, daughter of Shah Jahan, sister of Aurangzeb, a princess born into opulence, but drawn toward fire. She could have been an empress. She chose to be something stranger, a mystic wrapped in silk, part saint, part seductress, and entirely impossible to control. Let's rewind to when she was 15. Her mother, Mumtaz Mahal, the same whose death birthed the Taj Mahal, had just died in childbirth, leaving behind a palace soaked in grief. And in that vacuum of sorrow, young Jahanara stepped forward, not timidly, but with a quiet ferocity that unsettled the entire court. She took over her mother's household duties, managed the imperial zenana, and began issuing orders that sounded more like poetry than policy. And everyone obeyed, not because they had to, but because something about her voice made disobedience feel vulgar. The courtiers started calling her Padshah Begum, empress in all but name. But here's the twist that most textbooks forget to mention. Jahanara didn't just rule through decorum. She ruled through seduction of the mind, of the soul, of anyone foolish enough to underestimate her. And she never married. She refused every proposal, no matter how politically advantageous. That alone made her dangerous. Because a single, powerful woman at court wasn't just an anomaly, it was a threat. She didn't need a husband to increase her influence. She already owned entire cities in her name, funded Sufi shrines, and commissioned architectural projects that rivaled her father's. One fringe tidbit? She personally funded the reconstruction of the shrine of Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer and Co. Act that elevated her status among both mystics and merchants. But she didn't do it for politics. She did it because she believed, deeply, even inconveniently. Historians still argue whether Jahanara ever had lovers. Official records claim she remained celibate, devoted entirely to Sufism and statecraft. But letters from European travelers hint otherwise. One describes a moonlit evening where Jahanara recited Persian ghazals to a Portuguese musician, the two of them seated under a peepal tree, their knees almost touching. Nothing explicit. Just a conversation that lingered too long. Another account mentions a veiled woman in the market of Delhi, purchasing rare adders while accompanied by a man who addressed her in Andalusian Arabic. Could have been anyone. But the guards who followed her always reported back to the palace silently. That's the kind of woman she was. She made obedience feel like complicity. What's even more astonishing is her relationship with her brother. Aurangzeb, polar opposites. He, the Puritan. She, the mystic. He, the law. She, the fragrance just outside the law's reach. And yet, despite their friction, he trusted her more than any other sibling. Even after imprisoning their father, even after seizing the throne, Aurangzeb let Jahanara remain in court. Let her speak freely. Let her walk the gardens unescorted. Why? Because he feared her? Perhaps, but more likely because he loved her. Not inappropriately, but helplessly. She was, after all, a mirror he couldn't look away from, what the empire might have been. Had it chosen softness over steel. Asterisk, you imagine Jahanara wandering the halls of Shah Jahan's Red Fort barefoot, her feet whispering against the stone. She stops by a window, reads a passage from Rumi, and smiles faintly, not because she agrees, but because she knows it will make a soldier nearby blush. She sends secret poems to Sufi saints, laced with political advice. She meets merchants disguised as mendicants. Her rooms smell of jasmine and ink. And on certain nights, they say, she lights candles in a spiral formation, then walks among them in silence, whispering names no one else can hear. One of the more peculiar moments in her life. She once requested a meeting with a Jesuit monk who had refused to eat for spiritual reasons. Instead of lecturing him, she brought him a bowl of fruit and asked him to describe the colors as if they were sins. He wept. She didn't flinch. That, in a single vignette, is Jahanara. You might wonder why a woman of such talent never seized power outright. The answer is both obvious and tragic. The Mughal world wasn't built for female rule. It was built for female influence, provided it stayed ornamental, obedient, and invisible. Jahanara shattered that structure, not by defying it outright, but by bending it so elegantly it forgot it had rules. She wore white when others wore crimson. She fasted on days when the court feasted. And yet, she was always in the emperor's ear. Later in life, she wrote a Sufi treatise so dense and poetic that scholars today still argue over whether it's theology or veiled autobiography. In it, she speaks of annihilation, not of the body, but of the ego, of burning down the self until only light remains. And you, half asleep now, might picture her standing at a window, her hair unbound, speaking to no one. "If love must destroy me," she whispers, "then let it be swift and fragrant." In her final years, she faded gracefully from public life, but not into irrelevance. She spent more time in gardens, wrote long letters to mystics, and designed her own tomb, a modest marble pavilion open to the sky. No grand mausoleum, no dome. Just light and wind and space to disappear. And even in death, she left behind no scandal, no legacy of broken alliances or palace intrigue. Only a question: how much power can a woman wield if she never asks for it? The candle by the window burns low now. She stands, her silk robes gathering shadows, and walks deeper into the palace. The wind closes the door behind her. Not with a bang, with a hush. You find yourself in a garden that smells like crushed marigolds and treason. The grass is too green, the air too still, and every bird seems to be watching. In the center of this unsettling calm, there's a man reclining on a silver inlaid daybed, holding a glass of wine as if it were an instrument of state. This is Jahangir, son of Akbar, heir to a philosophy, and an emperor of appetites. And standing beside him, adjusting the drape of her pearl-stitched veil, is a woman who was never meant to be queen, but became one by rewriting the rules as she walked past them. Nur Jahan, light of the world, widow, poet, hunter, and political. Hurricane in silk slippers. You're watching them now, Jahangir with his wine, Nur Jahan with her ledger, and already, you know which one is in charge. Let's rewind to her entrance. Born Merunisa, daughter of a Persian refugee, she grew up in the outskirts of Mughal privilege, close enough to see its glitter, far enough to feel its chill. She married young, not to a prince, but to a soldier. Then fate did what it loves. To do it intervened messily. Her husband died, some say executed, others say conveniently eliminated, and she found herself widowed in a court that preferred its women decorative and docile. She was neither. And when Jahangir met her, it wasn't at a royal reception. It was in a garden during Nowruz celebrations. She wore lavender. She did not bow. He watched her pick a pomegranate, open it with one hand, and offer it without smiling. That was the beginning. What followed was not just a romance, it was an imperial restructuring. Within months, she had not only married the emperor, but begun issuing royal decrees in her own name. Coins were minted bearing her signature. Foreign envoys bowed to her. Court artists painted her not as consort, but as sovereign. And Jahangir? He watched, bemused, wine in hand, as his wife rearranged the machinery of empire to run through her fingers. Historians still argue whether Jahangir was complicit or simply in love beyond reason. Some say she manipulated a weak man. Others say he, recognizing her brilliance, simply stepped aside. Either way, it worked. You imagine their evenings together, not passionate in the way poets describe, but intimate like shared ambition. They discussed prison reforms over dinner, debated art commissions before bed. She hunted tigers from the back of an elephant. He wrote memoirs in which her name appears more frequently than his own achievements. Once, when asked who ruled the empire, a courtier whispered, "The emperor in public, the empress in reality." One fringe detail: Nur Jahan had a private network of spies made up almost entirely of palace servants, gardeners, midwives, even flute players. She knew more about court movements than her generals did. And she used that knowledge not for blackmail, but for balance. Information, after all, is the subtlest seduction. But it wasn't just politics. Their love, though carefully curated, was real. Jahangir once delayed an entire military campaign because Nur Jahan had fallen ill with a fever. He stayed at her bedside for days, refusing to eat until she did. Court records note a dramatic scene involving rose-scented compresses and whispered prayers to Sufi saints. That wasn't theater. That was a man terrified of losing the only person who made ruling feel like companionship. Yet even in this apparent paradise, the cracks formed. Ambition, when too sharp, starts cutting allies. Nur Jahan's increasing control made enemies. Princes grumbled. Ministers seethed. And when Jahangir's health began to fail, exacerbated by opium and wine, her political maneuvering became more overt. She tried to position her son-in-law as heir, bypassing Jahangir's natural-born sons. That's when love collided with legacy. The backlash was swift. When Jahangir died during a return journey from Kashmir, the court turned cold. Nur Jahan, once the woman who whispered to emperors, found herself sidelined by men who preferred their rulers sober and their queens silent. She was stripped of power, her allies scattered, but she didn't fall apart. She retreated, she built gardens, she wrote poetry. She raised her grandniece Mumtaz Mahal, who would go on to marry Shah Jahan and inspire the Taj Mahal. A legacy passed not through titles, but through storytelling. One peculiar anecdote: in her final years, she commissioned a mirror chamber for herself, filled with tiny glass fragments and low lamplight. She would sit there at dusk, surrounded by 1,000 flickering versions of her own reflection, and meditate. Not on power lost, but on light, shadow, and the delicate architecture of memory. No one was allowed in except a mute servant and the occasional cat. You can almost hear the silence there, thick, scented, and oddly comforting. Even today, historians can't agree on Nur Jahan. Was she a manipulator or a genius? A feminist icon or a royal opportunist? Maybe the better question is, why can't she be all of those things at once? The Mughal court was a place where roles were written in ink. That faded quickly. Nur Jahan simply wrote hers in gold. And you, resting now in the warmth of their garden, understand something deeper. This wasn't just a love story. It was a co-regency of the heart and the state. A partnership in which seduction wasn't an act, it was a form of governance. The wineglass is empty now. The garden fades into dusk. And somewhere, in a dusty archive, her signature still glimmers faintly on a coin outlasting even the empire it once helped rule. You're standing now in a hall that breathes silence, where even your thoughts seem too loud. The walls here don't boast, they mourn. Intricate marble flowers are frozen mid-bloom, delicate as bone, and the air smells faintly of ash and rosewater. Ahead, past columns that echo with soft grief, you see a man seated on a low stool, his head bent, hands trembling slightly as they trace the outline of a letter he's already read 100 times. This is Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal. And in this moment, He is not a ruler. He is a man unraveling. Because the woman he loved more than life is gone, and all he has left are love letters that bleed gold and silence that won't answer. You've heard the romantic version. Of course. Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, the great love story of the Mughal world. The perfect wife, the devoted husband, the monument so beautiful it made the stars jealous. But what if the story is even more haunting than you thought? What if this wasn't just love? It was obsession disguised as devotion, a grief so rich it bankrupted an empire? What if Shah Jahan didn't just build the Taj Mahal out of mourning, but because he believed that if beauty could be carved deeply enough into stone, it might bring her back? Let's rewind to the beginning. Mumtaz wasn't just his wife. She was his confidant, his co-conspirator, his emotional anchor in a court filled with venomous ambition. Married at 14, she quickly became the center of his world, not because she was submissive, but because she was clever. She advised on court appointments, managed his treasury, and read poetry beside him while scribes took notes. Shah Jahan trusted her not just with his heart, but with the logic of empire. When she died in 1631, giving birth to their 14th child, something shattered inside him. Something that never quite healed. In the weeks that followed her death, he refused to appear in public. He didn't bathe. He wore white mourning robes and isolated himself in a chamber where even servants spoke only in whispers. One record notes that when he finally emerged, his hair had turned almost entirely gray. Not from age, from grief. Historians still argue whether that detail was exaggerated by court chroniclers, or if emotional trauma really did bleach the black from his beard. Either way, the image lingers, an emperor whose heart broke so visibly the court flinched when they looked at him. Mourning, in Shah Jahan's hands, wasn't passive. It was architectural. He poured his loss into marble, into geometry, into perfection. The Taj Mahal wasn't built as a show of power, it was built as a desperate plea to eternity. Remember her. He summoned the finest architects from across the empire, Persian calligraphers, Turkish masons, Indian artisans. For 22 years they labored, layering grief into stone so delicately that it seemed to glow at sunrise. And he visited it often not as a tourist, but like a man keeping vigil. One fringe detail. He ordered that each of the 99 names of God be inscribed around her tomb in a way that would reflect moonlight differently on every night of the lunar cycle. The idea was that no night would be the same, just as no memory of her ever felt identical. That's not architecture. That's yearning made permanent. But here's where the story darkens. That same devotion became obsession. As costs spiraled, as political rivals sharpened their knives, Shah Jahan kept building. He planned a matching black mausoleum for himself across the Yamuna River, a monument of shadow facing her tomb of light. Connected by a bridge of silver, his court begged him to stop. His treasurers warned him the empire was bleeding. He didn't listen. He couldn't, because somewhere in his mind, Mumtaz was still alive as long as the marble stayed warm. His son, Aurangzeb, saw things differently. Practical, austere, unimpressed by sentiment. He staged a coup, placed his father under house arrest in Agra Fort, and quietly ended the Black Mausoleum plan. Shah Jahan lived the rest of his life in a suite of rooms with one window, a view of the Taj Mahal, visible across the river. Imagine that. A man who ruled half the known world, confined to a room built like a jewelry box, staring every day at the ghost of a woman who would never answer. And yet, even in captivity, he didn't stop writing to her. He kept journals, filled with letters addressed to the Empress, noting changes in the light on her dome, dreams he had of her perfume, the sound he imagined her anklets would make on marble. Some of these were found decades later, tucked between ledgers and forgotten poetry scrolls. They're not royal, they're raw. One ends simply, "You took the sun with you. I grow cold. You lie there, absorbing the weight of it all, and realized that love stories aren't always made of roses and perfect endings. Sometimes they're made of marble and madness. Sometimes the most romantic thing a man can do is refuse to let go, even when everyone else has moved on. Shah Jahan wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a man who believed that memory could be carved into the bones of the earth. That loss, if made beautiful enough, could become a kind of immortality. The Taj Mahal still stands, of course. Tourists flock there, pose for photos, marvel at the symmetry. But none of them hear the letters. None of them feel the pulse of grief that hums through the stone at night. Only you do. Because tonight, you walked through the silence. You watched the emperor's hands tremble. You read the letter that bled gold. And somewhere, in the glow of moonlight on white marble, she listens. You're standing now beneath a dome so perfectly curved, it seems to hold its breath. The walls shimmer, not with paint, but with stone inlaid so precisely that it reflects the moonlight like a whisper passed from one lover to another. You're inside the Taj Mahal, but you are not here for its beauty. You are here for its ghosts. Because tonight, the tomb doesn't sleep. Tonight, the marble remembers. It remembers blood, ambition, betrayal, and the rumors that stain its perfect white surface like invisible ink only history can read. You walk slowly across the cool floor, passing the cenotaphs of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. The carvings are delicate, the calligraphy divine, but what draws your attention is not what's seen, it's what's missing. What lies beneath? The actual tombs are far below, sealed away, hidden from the world, surrounded by legends that no tour guide will repeat. And one of those legends claims that love was not the only thing buried here. That there are others, servants, artisans, perhaps even rivals entombed silently beneath the foundations, swallowed to protect a dream made of marble and obsession. But that's just one layer. Tonight, you're following another whisper, the story that while Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal for Mumtaz, her spirit was not pleased. That she weeps, not because she is mourned, but because she is trapped. You hear the rumor whispered by a Sufi at the edge of Agra, who claims the mausoleum is too symmetrical, too perfect, that it offends the natural chaos of life, and thus cannot hold peace. A tomb made by love, but not for rest. And so Mumtaz walks. At dusk, the wind that rustles the cypress trees is said to carry her perfume. The candle flames inside the cenotaph chamber, even the electric ones, flicker when no one moves. A ripple through memory. But of course we're being poetic. Or are we? The empire was. Because beyond the ghost stories, there's another, far more earthly shadow cast across the Taj. The cost. Building the mausoleum consumed a staggering portion of the imperial treasury. Its architects were paid in silver dust. Its stones came from as far as Rajasthan, its jade from China, its turquoise from Tibet. Thousands labored through heat, monsoon, and plague. It is said that the chief mason's hands were cut off so he could never replicate its beauty, though historians still debate the truth of that claim. Whether fact or myth, the rumor itself reveals something vital. The Taj was not just a labor of love, it was a declaration of dominance, a beautiful one. But still a declaration, and that declaration had consequences. While Shah Jahan focused his gaze on the white dome across the Yamuna, rebellion brewed at the borders. His court, once vibrant with philosophy and debate, grew brittle, drained by extravagance and the ghost of a woman whose memory refused to fade. One letter from a court minister describes a dinner where the emperor sat in silence for hours, speaking only once to correct the pronunciation of her name in a poem recitation. That kind of devotion does not inspire confidence in war councils. His children saw it too. Aurangzeb, especially. The youngest son. Quiet, devout, a man of swords and scripture. He watched his father's grief congeal into stagnation and made a choice. Love was a luxury empires could not afford. When the moment came, he moved swiftly, deposed his father, and imprisoned him in Agra fort with a window facing the Taj, not out of cruelty, but to let him look at the thing that ruined him, that Aurangzeb believed was justice, or perhaps penance. Yet the building endured. Long after its creator's heart stopped, long after his son's wars reshaped the empire, the Taj Mahal outlived them all. Even today, it still gleams at sunrise, glows at dusk, and hides 1,000 contradictions inside its walls. Romance and ruin, devotion and decay, and one quiet mystery. If the Taj Mahal is truly the world's greatest monument to love, why does it feel so terribly lonely? One fringe detail that almost no one hears. A letter recovered from the private quarters of a Mughal princess, written in an unassuming script, recounts a night when she sat inside the Taj alone, and felt not peace, but pressure, as if the air itself pressed down on her shoulders, asking for something she could not give. She ended the note with a single line: "It is too beautiful to be empty." What did she mean? No one knows, but the line survives, etched into memory like another name on the wall. And perhaps that is what this place truly is. Not just a tomb, not just a shrine, but a question. A place where you lie now, half asleep, and ask yourself whether love is enough. Whether beauty, carved deeply enough, can hold back time. Whether devotion, left unchecked, becomes its own kind of prison. You run your fingers along the cold marble, and it doesn't answer. But it does remember. So tonight, you walk out the same way you came in, your shadow trailing behind you like a ghost politely keeping distance. You don't look back. You don't need to. The Taj will wait. It always does. You're stepping now into a darker corridor of the empire, colder, narrower, the air denser with silence that doesn't invite but warns. The lamps flicker in their niches, casting long stretching shadows that move even when you don't. You pass a doorway draped with black fabric, embroidered with verses from the Quran, so finely stitched they look like threads of night itself. You're entering the reign of Aurangzeb, the austere emperor, the sword-bearing son, the man who claimed to restore righteousness and ended up dismantling the poetry of an entire dynasty. Tonight, the tale is not about seduction, but about its denial. Not about love expressed, but desire suppressed until it turned to iron. Because this emperor, whose name still divides historians and textbooks, had a sex life that reads less like a romance and more like a battle report, measured, strategic, and frighteningly efficient. Aurangzeb did not drink. He did not write love poetry. He refused music in court and once issued an order for all instruments in the palace to be broken or locked away. He dismissed court painters, banned celebrations, and replaced artistic indulgence with long hours in prayer and stricter taxation. But in the shadows of this piety, there were still women. 5 wives to be exact, and countless concubines. Because even the most devout must navigate the architecture of desire, even if they pretend to do it by accident. His first wife, Dilris, Banu Begum, was a Shia princess from Persia. A sharp mind, a cold smile, and it said, the only woman who could interrupt him without punishment. Their letters, what few remain, suggest a relationship less passionate than respectful, full of formal pleasantries, spiritual quotations, and rare flickers of gentle wit. She died early after childbirth complications, and Aurangzeb reportedly wept in private for several days. But he never held another woman in such esteem. The rest were consorts, useful, necessary, silent. Historians still argue whether Aurangzeb's sexual life was truly limited or simply hidden under layers of orthodoxy. Court gossip, however, tells another story. Whispers speak of a concubine named Zainab, whose beauty was so otherworldly that even Aurangzeb, the self-declared warrior of virtue, arranged for her quarters to be placed adjacent to the mosque, frequented so he might hear her singing as he passed, though he banned others from listening. Contradiction? Perhaps, or maybe desire, suppressed too tightly, simply finds stranger exits. One fringe tidbit? A Sufi chronicler once claimed Aurangzeb had a dream in which he stood before God, only to be judged not for the wars he waged or the temples he raised, but for every smile he denied himself. When the emperor heard of this tale circulating, he didn't deny it. He had the storyteller exiled to Gujarat, not executed, just removed out of earshot. The implication lingered. Even Aurangzeb understood that control was sometimes just a seer. Performance with fewer actors, yet he still married, still fathered children, still fulfilled his duties as emperors were expected to do. But even in his most private acts, there was a discipline that bordered on the eerie. Records note that he scheduled his visits to the harem like military appointments, never more than once a week, always after evening prayers, never during fasting periods. No wine, no music, just a clean, formal intimacy that, according to court attendants, felt more like a meeting than a moment of affection. You try to imagine what that feels like, to reduce longing to protocol, to measure the rhythm of human connection with the same hand that signs execution orders. And yet, beneath all this cold surface, something softer flickers. Letters from his daughters, particularly Zinat and Nissa, reveal a man capable of tenderness, albeit buried beneath doctrine. She once wrote, "My father gave me a book of hadiths and a kiss on the forehead and said, 'Read these before you sleep. They will keep the world quiet.'" That doesn't sound like cruelty. That sounds like someone who was terrified of his own softness, and so armored it in righteousness. His relationship with his sisters, however, was more complicated, especially with Roshanara Begum, a woman whose name you've heard before, and whose choices will soon follow more closely. She helped him seize power from their brother Dara Shikoh, yet later fell from his favor, accused of extravagance, corruption, and moral decay. Some say it wasn't her behavior that offended him, but her mirror. She represented the life he denied himself. A life of art, pleasure, and clever disobedience. Removing her was easier than confessing that some part of him wanted to be her. You lie there now, listening to the faint echo of footsteps in that corridor of discipline, and wonder what kind of man builds an empire on austerity, but cannot stop. Listening for one woman's singing through a wall. The same man who banned dancing girls from court, but allowed a troupe to perform only once for a visiting Ottoman envoy. He did not watch. He prayed in the next room. But the envoy later wrote, his ears twitched with the beat. Small detail, heavy meaning, because even the most iron-bound kings are still made of skin. Even those who forbid touch still dream of being touched. The Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb reached its largest territorial size, but it also began to crack. Not just from rebellion and resistance, but from something subtler, the disappearance of beauty. The soft hum that once connected court to art, faith to pleasure, emperor to lover, it faded. And in that silence, the marble echoed. Some scholars say Aurangzeb died in peace, reciting the Quran with trembling lips and clear conscience. Others say he left behind a note that reads simply, "I came alone, and I go alone." Both may be true. But you know better than to trust last words. You know to listen for the things not written. The candles he extinguished, the music he forbade, the smiles he swallowed like sin. You roll onto your side now, the weight of all that discipline settling around you like a wool blanket in summer. Heavy, hot, unnecessary, but oddly comforting, if only because you know it wasn't built to last. Empires ruled by denial don't vanish, they slowly forget themselves. And in that forgetting, sometimes the heart finally speaks. You wake up in the scent of sandalwood and scandal. The floor beneath you is warm, freshly swept, and the sound that draws your attention isn't music, it's applause. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. And then you see her, a woman draped in crimson silk, her anklets chiming with every step, her hands raised not in supplication, but in command. She isn't royalty. She isn't a noble's daughter. She's a courtesan. And she has just embarrassed a room full of ministers without saying a single word. Her name is Anarkali, or so the story goes, and tonight, you're about to enter the side of the Mughal Empire that historians politely cough over, the glittering, dangerous world of courtesans who danced between power and peril, seduction and survival, love and leverage. Let's get something straight right away. In the Mughal court, courtesans weren't just dancers. They were conversationalists, poets, linguists, musicians, spies. They weren't ornaments, they were institutions. They learned to recite the Quran and erotic poetry in the same breath. They could soothe a general and humiliate a vizier over tea. Their homes were salons. Their influence? Unwritten but unforgettable. And at the center of this whispering world was one woman whose legend became so potent, even emperors feared to speak her name aloud. Anarkali, pomegranate blossom, was said to be a dancer in the court of Akbar. Some say she was Persian. Others a local beauty trained in the elite art schools of Lahore. She was appointed to teach music and etiquette to the royal harem, which meant she had proximity, polish, and just enough anonymity to be dangerous. And then, the prince noticed her. Salim, the future Jahangir, spoiled, fiery, passionate. He was drawn to her, not just because she was beautiful, but because she didn't flinch when he stared. And that's rare, especially when you're staring like a prince used to getting everything. Their affair, according to the legends, burned hot and fast. Secret meetings in jasmine-filled corridors, love poems passed inside fruit, hidden walks, under moonlight that were somehow not quite hidden. Servants talked, so did the walls, and then Akbar found out. The emperor who had orchestrated entire empires with delicate marriages and quiet diplomacy was faced with something he could not control. His heir in love with a woman who could not be married, could not be trusted, could not be erased. Or so he thought. Historians still argue over whether Anarkali existed. Some say she's just a metaphor for rebellion or a romantic ghost retrofitted into Mughal lore. But buried beneath the myth is something tangible records of a dancer exiled. Abruptly, of court documents redacted without explanation, of Salim's strange poetry during those years, dripping with grief and rage. And a Lahore tomb, anonymous yet lovingly preserved, with a single couplet inscribed in Persian. Asterisk. If I could behold my beloved just once more, I would gladly give up my life. That's not myth. That's mourning carved in stone. One fringe tidbit. A rare Portuguese trader's diary describes a scandal in the Mughal court involving a dancer who vanished overnight, after being accused of stealing the prince's attention, and some said, the imperial ring. The diary never names her. But it includes a sketch. Eyes like daggers. Anklets shaped like peacock feathers. It matches an illustration later found in a courtier's private collection, labeled only asterisk. She who was buried standing. Yes, buried standing. That's the dark twist. The legend says Akbar, to punish the betrayal and preserve the dignity of the throne, ordered Anarkali sealed alive behind a wall. No public execution, just silence. A slow, ceremonial erasure. They say she stood tall, didn't cry, and as the bricks were laid, she recited verses from Rumi. Whether true or not, the story stuck. Because in the empire of sword and silk, the most terrifying fate wasn't death. It was being forgotten, but she wasn't. Salim never let her vanish entirely. When he became Jahangir, he reportedly visited her tomb in secret. Commissioned marble screen around it. Composed verses that court scribes weren't allowed to archive. In one surviving note, he writes, asterisk, some flowers are too fierce for vases. They must be planted in legend. Asterisk, you lie there, listening to the faint chime of imaginary anklets on marble, and you realize that power didn't always come from bloodlines. Sometimes it came in the form of a woman who could tell a prince no and make it sound like a promise. Courtesans like Anarkali were dangerous not because they seduced, but because they were unforgettable. And in an empire obsessed with memory architecture, inscriptions, lineage being unforgettable was the most subversive act of all. And Anarkali wasn't alone. The Mughal court was a galaxy of women like her. Educated, refined, and sharp enough to see through the fragile egos of the men around them. They weren't passive victims. They were survivalists with charm as armor, wit as their dagger. They wrote their own scripts in rooms where even scribes dared not enter. One dancer, Gulbadan, once publicly corrected a prince's pronunciation of a Persian verse during a music recital. Instead of being punished, she was invited to perform in the emperor's personal quarters for a month. Another, Sayra Bano, composed erotic riddles that doubled as political satire passed from concubine to noblewoman, wrapped in perfume-soaked paper. These women understood the rules of court better than the men who wrote them. They broke them. Not loudly, but gracefully, like slipping out of a dance step and still landing perfectly on beat. And so tonight, you lie still, eyes heavy, heart full of those quiet rebellions. The courtesan doesn't need a crown. She doesn't need a title. She needs only one look, one line, one moment that lingers in a prince's mind longer than a treaty or a war. And long after the empire crumbles, long after the monuments fade, and the history books gloss her over, she still dances. Not for applause, not for seduction, but because she was there. Because she mattered. Because the story isn't complete without her. You hear the applause again, fainter now, fading into night. But it's still for her. You find yourself in a dim library where no one speaks above a whisper and the scent of old paper clings to the air like a memory. Shelves stretch toward the ceiling, sagging under the weight of centuries, and in the corner, resting on a silk-covered podium, is a manuscript bound in cracked leather. You open it carefully, and what you see is not scripture, not a royal decree, but a guide to pleasure. Diagrams, metaphors, verses that ripple with suggestion. And at the center of it all, an unmistakable name written in gold ink, Kama Sutra. But this isn't India's ancient past. This is Mughal India, steeped in Persian ethics and imperial politics. So what is this book doing here? Why is it still being copied, circulated, studied, sometimes even banned? Because tonight, you're stepping into the simmering contradiction. At the heart of the empire, the Mughal Kama Sutra debates, where desire clashed with decorum, and intimacy became a battlefield between philosophy and power. Let's begin with the setting. The Mughals, descended from Mongol warriors and Persian poets, governed with a curious duality. They built mosques and palaces with equal grandeur. They commissioned Quranic calligraphy and erotic miniatures in the same breath. At court, Sufi mystics preached restraint while dancers performed in saris, designed to flutter at precisely the right moment. And somewhere between these contradictions lived the Kama Sutra, not just as a dusty Sanskrit relic, but as a living, breathing document passed between courtiers, copied by calligraphers, read aloud during quiet evenings, sometimes with blushes, sometimes with smirks. Historians still argue whether the Mughals embraced or suppressed the Kama Sutra. Orthodox scribes claimed it was un-Islamic, a remnant of pagan India. But others, especially those in the court's artistic circles, saw it differently. They viewed it not as lewd instruction, but as philosophy. A text about harmony, rhythm, power, pleasure, gender. A book that treated intimacy not as sin, but as skill. It was never mainstream, of course. It was whispered about, debated in corners, veiled in euphemism. But it survived, sometimes because of courtesans, sometimes because of queens. Yes, queens. You might be surprised, but women in the harem had access to this text. In fact, some versions were specifically annotated for female readers. One fringe detail: A copy once belonged to Hamida Banu Begum, Akbar's mother, with handwritten notes in the margins correcting certain metaphors to better reflect the female experience. Another copy, gilded and richly illustrated, was said to have circulated in the Zenana under the nickname Asterisk, the mirror that does not lie. In a world where female sexuality was often monitored, shaped, and repressed, these women claimed their knowledge quietly, through poetry, through private readings, through coded conversation disguised as medical advice. But it wasn't just the women. Mughal men, especially those trained in the Persian tradition, were equally fascinated. For them, mastery of pleasure wasn't indulgence. It was a display of control. One nobleman wrote that, "A man who cannot read the pulse of passion is not fit to govern the body, let alone a kingdom." This wasn't locker room bravado. It was elite theory. Just as rulers trained in military tactics and religious law, they were expected to understand ishq, passionate love, as both spiritual metaphor and physical reality. Erotic skill was framed not as sin, but as sophistication. Still, not everyone agreed. Aurangzeb, of course, banned the text, ordered all visible copies destroyed, but even he could not erase it. Copies were hidden, buried in library walls, passed hand to hand in veiled wrappers. A librarian in Lucknow once confessed, decades later, that he kept a copy sewn into the binding of a Quranic commentary, simply because to destroy knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, is worse than to misuse it. You nod, understanding that truth transcends doctrine. Desire, after all, doesn't ask permission. The Kama Sutra wasn't just about sex positions. It explored courtship, emotional intelligence, role play, flirtation, even aphrodisiacs and love potions. Mughals found this especially useful, blending the text's guidance with their own cultural tastes. Mango was favored over coconut. Rose adder preferred to camphor. Some even developed their own chapters. One rumored section titled Pleasure Under Turban was composed by a Mughal courtier known only by his pen name Rangbaz, which translates to the one who plays with color. His version, cheekier and more poetic, added a Mughal twist, a section on how to seduce a philosopher without losing the argument. One peculiar example? In Shah Jahan's reign, an illustrated manual on perfume blending was discovered in the Imperial Library. The images mirrored those found in erotic texts, but instead of lovers, it depicted roses being opened, spices ground, oils warming on naked backs of ceramic vessels. Sensuality reimagined through metaphor, but it's there, plain as moonlight. On silk, the subtext was the text. And yet, for all this quiet tolerance, public conversation remained restricted. So the Kama Sutra lived in mirrors, in metaphors, in miniature paintings where women applied kohl to one another's eyes too slowly, where musicians held their flutes like lovers. These visual cues were understood instantly by the courtiers, who had read the book and could recognize a suggestive gesture from across a garden. The untrained eye would see art. The trained heart would see invitation. You lie still now, tracing the idea through time, feeling the breath of an empire that both feared and needed pleasure. Not because it was indulgent, but because it reminded people they were human. The Mughals loved paradox. They recited holy verses in palaces built for decadence. They condemned vice with one hand and painted it beautifully with the other. And through it all, texts like the Kama Sutra whispered beneath the surface, reminding everyone emperor, queen, courtesan that power without intimacy is empty, and pleasure without understanding is fleeting. So tonight, as the pages flutter closed and the candle burns lower beside the podium, you understand something vital. The Mughal Kama Sutra debate was never about whether desire was moral. It was about who got to talk about it, who got to read it, who got to shape it into wisdom instead of weapon. And you've read it too now, haven't you? Or at least the echoes of it. Somewhere, a curtain sways, a book is returned to its shelf, and the page, golden at its edge, turns itself. You step now into the hush of midnight gardens, where lanterns float like stars that forgot to rise and laughter hangs in the jasmine air like an aftertaste. This is not a public space. This is not a palace court. This is a forbidden garden, hidden behind layers of stone and etiquette, where Mughal nobles and their lovers met not under chandeliers, but under banyan trees strung with silk ribbons and perfume. You're not supposed to be here. No one is. That's what made it so irresistible. Tonight, we leave the throne rooms and the royal marriages behind and follow the fragrance trail of after-dark rendezvous moments tucked into shadows, too fleeting for history books but far too vivid to forget. This is the domain of Delhi's secret courtyards, where poets seduced spies and the perfume of desire was sometimes literal. Imagine the gates opening just a crack. A eunuch slips through, a note pressed into a gloved hand. Then silence. Hours later, footsteps barefoot always cross the tiled floor. The door doesn't creak because it's been oiled with rose water. The lamps are lit, but only halfway. No one speaks above a whisper because everyone knows what's at stake. A wrong word, a wrong witness, and what began as poetry could end as treason. But they come anyway, princes disguised in shawls, concubines veiled like merchants' wives, even foreign diplomats hoping to barter political favors for one evening of Mughal indulgence. One of the most notorious gardens belonged to a noblewoman, known simply as Layla Begum, not a royal, not a courtesan, something in between. A widow with lands of her own and no children, she transformed her estate into a sanctuary of sensual diplomacy. By day, she ran a modest perfume trade. By night, she hosted gatherings where politics melted under poetry, and alliances began with shared hookah smoke and glances that meant everything and nothing. She was never officially recognized by the court, but letters addressed to the mistress of moonlit gatherings arrived weekly. Even Aurangzeb, that Puritan of Puritans, allegedly sent an envoy to demand she stop hosting. She replied with a gift, a sandalwood fan, and a verse that read asterisk, "Even God listens better when the air is sweet." She was left alone. Historians still debate whether Layla's garden was merely an elite social club or something, closer to a political salon hidden under petals and pearls. Some surviving invitations, written in poetry, sealed with fig leaf wax list guest names that included generals, Sufi mystics, astrologers, and musicians. Not exactly a neutral crowd. But no records exist of scandals. That was the rule. What was said under the banyan stayed under the banyan. One fringe detail: Layla Begum was rumored to have hired a scent master, a man whose sole job was to design personalized fragrance profiles for each guest based on their voice, their gait, and their emotional aura. He'd blend essences with such precision that by the time guests arrived, the garden itself already smelled like their desire. Imagine being so known by your scent that your arrival was registered before you even spoke. That's not vanity. That's orchestration at a level of intimacy most modern. Relationships will never touch. But it wasn't all soft cushions and flirtation. These gardens were also stages for intelligence. Information leaked through gossip, through intoxicated murmurs, through pillow talk disguised as poetry. The Mughals didn't underestimate these gatherings. They monitored them. Eunuchs carried coded messages. Letters were copied and archived. Spies from rival factions attended regularly, sometimes seducing their way into favor, sometimes simply listening from behind carved screens. One evening, recorded in a forgotten diplomat's journal, tells of a masked dancer whose performance was so haunting that a general confessed to abandoning a campaign just to see her again. She vanished after one appearance. Some say she was a spy sent by the Safavids. Others say she was an exiled princess using dance as camouflage. Either way, the performance left behind no name, just the scent of myrrh and a half-finished glass of pomegranate wine. And then there were the poets. Always the poets. Because if you wanted to understand Mughal desire, You didn't look at laws or edicts. You read the poems left behind. Verses about bodies as palaces, kisses as treaties, longing as empire. The poets wrote not for money, but for invitations. A clever verse could earn you entry into Layla's garden. A truly unforgettable one might earn you a night on the swing bench with the woman herself. And the swing was sacred. Draped in silk, suspended from an old mango tree, it was said that anyone who sat there would forget time. And often rank, even emperors slipped into these spaces in disguise. Akbar was known to wander the gardens of Agra at night, wrapped in a shawl, listening to folk songs and asking strangers philosophical questions just to hear their accents. Jahangir once composed a note to a dancer he met in a secret garden, comparing her scent to the last line of a forgotten prayer. Shah Jahan, despite his grief-fueled monument building, kept a notebook of moonlight metaphors inspired by evenings spent in gardens that weren't supposed to exist. You lie there, your breath slowing, and realize something soft but sharp. These gardens weren't footnotes to the empire. They were its heartbeat after dark. Here, men and women remembered they had bodies. Here, speech became touch. Here, politics softened just long enough for intimacy to peek through the cracks. And that, perhaps, is the most Mughal truth of all. That behind every treaty was a verse. Behind every war, a rumor born under a peepal tree. That desire didn't merely distract power, it redirected it, with a glance, with a fragrance, with a single slow step through jasmine-scented grass. You close your eyes now, and for a moment, you are there. Under the tree, the lamp flickers. A voice hums a tune too old to name. And everything else falls away. You find yourself in a candlelit room filled with the rustle of silk and the soft scrape of calligraphy brushes. The scent is unfamiliar musk, ambergris, something darker, and there in the center of the room stands a woman in men's clothing, her cloak heavy with embroidery, her turban tied not out of modesty, but with the precision of a general. She looks directly at you, not through you, not around you. Straight at you, as if daring you to ask the wrong question. Her name is Roshanara Begum, and tonight, you are in the presence of a woman who seduced her way into history, not through flirtation or beauty, but through audacity so sharp it could cut emperors down to size. Roshanara was the daughter of Shah Jahan, sister to the more famous Jahanara, and eventual political patron of Aurangzeb. Where her sister walked through the empire like a poem, Roshanara moved like a blade. She wore men's boots, rode horses better than most generals, and spoke with a tone that made senior ministers lower their gaze mid-sentence. She wasn't raised to rule. She took it anyway. Because in a world that wanted women to whisper from behind veils, she laughed from the balconies and made the empire listen. Let's rewind. The Mughal succession crisis of the mid-17th century wasn't just a war. It was a family implosion wrapped in blood and theology. Shah Jahan had 4 sons, all ambitious, all charismatic, all flawed. Dara Shikoh, the eldest, was a mystic scholar with Sufi leanings. He was his father's favorite and groomed as heir. But Roshanara? She saw Dara as weak, too gentle, too obsessed with translating Hindu texts and quoting Rumi, and most importantly, too trusting. So while Dara hosted philosophers and fed poets, Roshanara slipped into her brother Aurangzeb's ear and began to craft a different future. Historians still argue about the depth of her involvement. Was she simply a messenger, or the puppet master herself? One thing is certain, she arranged secret communications between Aurangzeb and military commanders loyal to the east. She leaked Dara's plans. She advised Aurangzeb on the mood of the court, which nobles could be flipped, which alliances would fracture under pressure. And she did this while officially remaining a royal daughter, swaddled in silk and incense, attending poetry readings like nothing was happening. That's not manipulation. That's mastery, but she didn't just scheme, she survived. When Aurangzeb seized the throne, executing Dara and imprisoning their father. Roshanara was rewarded not with jewelry or land, but with power, real power. He made her Padshah Begum, placing her above every other woman in the empire, even their older sister. She was granted her own palace, her own treasury, even her own seal for imperial correspondence. Ministers bowed to her. Ambassadors waited. Weeks for an audience. And she, predictably, made them wait longer just to watch them squirm. One fringe detail: she reportedly commissioned a painting of herself on horseback, sword at her hip, accompanied not by maids but by guards. It was displayed in her private quarters and never publicly shown, but travelers from Persia and Central Asia left cryptic descriptions in their journals of a woman who ruled like a man, dined like a king, and refused to apologize for either. A rare note by a Portuguese envoy described her as a rose wrapped around iron, though he also admitted she frightened him. Roshanara's lifestyle didn't fit anyone's script. She rejected the veil, preferred wine to sherbet, and was known to invite poets and dancers to her residence for evenings that blended sharp political conversation with intimate gestures. Some claimed she took lovers' men in lower offices who were too flattered or too afraid to say no. Others say she lived alone, surrounded only by books, maps, and mirrors. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in the in-between, because that's where she always operated, not in rebellion, not in compliance, but in subversion so elegant it felt like a new form of royalty. But power rarely comes without backlash. As Aurangzeb's reign grew stricter, colder, more puritanical, Roshanara's flamboyance became a liability. She was accused of corruption, of overstepping, of spending from the treasury like it was a jewelry box. Ministers whispered that her loyalties were wavering, that she missed her sister Jahanara's grace, that maybe she had begun to regret what she had helped create. Aurangzeb, ever the tactician, didn't confront her directly. He simply withdrew, stripped her of titles, silenced her name in court records, and quietly let her fade. She lived the rest of her life in semi-exile, in a smaller palace on the outskirts of Delhi, still wealthy, still dangerous, still unreadable. She died unmarried, unrepentant, and unforgotten. Her tomb stands today near the shrine of Nizamuddin, tucked into a quiet corner where only a few visitors wander. No grand marble, no calligraphy, just her name, a date, and the echo of a life too large for any one version of history to contain. You lie still now. The image of Roshanara wrapped in your mind like her heavy cloak. You feel her presence not as warmth, but as heat. Controlled, directed, never wasted. And you realize that some women don't chase power. They inhabit it, not loudly, not by birthright, but by refusing to be erased. Roshanara never claimed to be noble. She claimed to be necessary. And for a moment, maybe longer, she was. The candle flickers. The brush pauses. And the woman in the turban turns away. You're lying beneath a painted ceiling swirling with constellations. Stars gilded in gold leaf, planets outlined in lapis. Each one labeled not with numbers, but names of lovers, kings, omens, and secrets. A breeze rustles the parchment scrolls hanging near an open window, and in the distance you hear the sound of bells, not from a temple, but from an astrologer's anklets. Because tonight, desire doesn't move blindly. It follows the stars. And the story you're about to drift into isn't just about sex or fate. It's about how the Mughal Empire mapped the human heart with the same precision it mapped the heavens. This is how sex shaped astrology, and how emperors came to believe that their bedrooms were constellations waiting to be interpreted. Imagine a court astrologer, robed in deep indigo, face lined with the ink of sleepless nights, surrounded by bronze instruments and palm leaf charts. He isn't a sideshow. He's essential. Every military campaign, every marriage, every birth, even the hour of intimacy between emperor and queen scheduled by the stars. One wrong moment could bring ruin. One well-timed night, the birth of an heir. You might think that sounds superstitious, but to the Mughals, it was science braided with seduction. Because astrology wasn't just about prediction, it was about alignment. Physical, cosmic, erotic. Let's start with the basics. The Mughal court operated under a hybrid calendar. Islamic lunar cycles blended with ancient Hindu astrological systems. The stars weren't a matter of belief. They were a matter of administration. And nowhere did they hold more power than in the private quarters. Shah Jahan reportedly refused to consummate a royal marriage until his astrologer declared Venus had fully emerged from retrograde. Akbar consulted planetary charts before naming his children. Even the layout of the harem was designed in harmony with zodiac logic: fire signs housed near the kitchens, water signs near the bathhouses, earth signs near the treasury vaults. It sounds like fantasy, but this was real. The architecture of desire had a blueprint, and it began with the stars. One fringe detail? There existed a position in the Mughal court known as the Moon Watcher, an official tasked with recording the emperor's nightly mood swings and comparing them to lunar fluctuations. When Jahangir went through bouts of melancholy, they charted it against Mars. When he grew suddenly affectionate, they blamed Venus. These logs, recovered in parts from dusty archives, read like diaries of divine dysfunction. One entry notes, "His Majesty wept at the song of a heron today. Mercury appears ascendant." Another simply says, "The Empress is advised not to approach until the moon wanes." Advice that, in hindsight, probably saved lives. But astrology wasn't just for emperors. It shaped the erotic lives of everyone in the palace. Harem women often carried personal horoscopes folded into amulet cases tied around their waists. Birth charts determined compatibility, not only for marriages but for affairs. One palace midwife famously matched a noble woman and a stable boy after charting their fire trine. Their brief affair was blamed for a minor palace scandal, yet decades later, love letters between them were found, wrapped in saffron cloth and scented with oud. Their stars had told the truth. The empire just hadn't listened. Even court poets got in on the action. A popular genre was the Tajia-i-Ishq astrological love poems. Lines like asterisk, "Your kiss delayed for Venus sleeps, but once she wakes, your touch will burn." Asterisk circulated between lovers like celestial permission slips. Some even composed horoscopes entirely in verse. Imagine being courted not with flowers, but with a custom forecast of your desire cycle. Romantic? Perhaps risky? Always. Historians still argue whether the Mughals truly believed in astrology or merely used it as a performance of control. But belief or not, the system had teeth. A wrong prediction could mean disgrace or worse. One royal astrologer who forecasted a son would be born during a particular lunar conjunction was dismissed when the child turned out to be a girl. He was later found selling fortune scrolls at a roadside shrine, bitter and muttering about retrogrades. Yet the system endured, because whether it worked or not, it gave the illusion that desire was governable, that seduction could be timed, that love, at its core, was a science. And that's where things get more sensual. The Kama Sutra, already whispered about in court, was sometimes reinterpreted through astrological terms. Certain positions were associated with specific planetary blessings. The chariot of Mars was favored for boldness. Venus's embrace recommended for reconciliation after quarrels. Manuals circulated, not officially endorsed, of course, but heavily copied, outlining which nights were best for which desires. Tuesdays for dominance, Fridays for tenderness, Saturdays to be avoided unless one enjoyed complicated regrets. One Persian text, likely smuggled in from Safavid Iran and annotated in the Mughal court, contains a curious diagram, a star chart overlaid with human bodies in various embraces, each pose marked by a corresponding planet. The text reads, asterisk, "As above, so within." Let your rhythms follow the heavens, and your longing will turn to peace. It's poetic nonsense to modern science. But to the empire, it was a map. And when everything else felt uncertain, politics, rebellion, inheritance, the stars at least seemed willing to answer. You lie there now, under that imaginary painted ceiling, wondering if your own chart was ever read by candlelight. Weather. A court astrologer once held a parchment, traced your rising sign, and whispered, "This one will dream deeply." You hope so. Because in that world, sleep wasn't just rest. It was alignment. And every sigh, every secret kiss, was another proof that the cosmos could be coaxed, seduced, even obeyed, if only you timed it right. The ink dries. The scroll is rolled. The bells chime once more. And the stars, far above, keep turning. You awaken in a chamber filled not with gold or gemstones, but with scent rich, layered, intoxicating. A haze of rose and oud swirls in the air, clinging to velvet drapes and embroidered cushions, so thick you could almost drink it. You're in a Mughal perfumery, but not the kind open to nobles or ambassadors. This is a private space, hidden inside the zanana, where desire is crafted drop by drop in silence. Here, perfume isn't accessory, it's weapon. It's identity. It's seduction before speech. And tonight, we inhale the world of Itar, the empire of perfume and desire, where every breath told a story, and every lover had a signature scent. The Mughals didn't just use perfume. They believed in it. They believed it carried not just beauty, but intent. A prince could be seduced with the right blend of saffron and amber. A letter sealed with jasmine oil could provoke longing before it was even read. And a woman's loyalty could be measured in the fragrance that lingered on her scarf when she returned from a walk. Smell, in this world, wasn't invisible. It was declaration. Let's begin with the art itself. Mughal perfumes known as Itar or Attar were distilled using centuries-old techniques that treated the creation of scent as a kind of alchemy. Petals boiled gently in copper stills, steam rising through bamboo pipes into clay receivers. One drop of pure rose oil could take 40,000 blossoms. It wasn't just chemistry. It was ritual. The distiller, often a woman in the harem trained in fragrance lore, would pray before beginning. Because if the scent was off by even a breath, the effect could backfire, turning attraction into headache, seduction into suspicion. One of the most powerful attars was meaty, made from the scent of rain on dry earth. Yes, rain. Captured in clay, infused into sandalwood, bottled like memory. Imagine wearing a perfume that smells like the moment monsoon touches parched soil. That wasn't indulgence. That was emotional warfare. A Mughal empress once wore mehdi during a diplomatic meeting, and the ambassador reportedly wept mid-negotiation. Coincidence? Unlikely. But beyond the technical mastery was the deeply personal logic of scent. Each member of the royal family had a custom profile. Akbar's blend reportedly contained rose, musk, and a hint of camphor, strong, spiritual, unforgettable. Nur Jahan favored saffron, crushed almond, and green vetiver, a fragrance that was said to smell like power and poetry simultaneously. One fringe detail: she kept her attars in crystal bottles shaped like birds, each corresponding to a mood. When she wore the nightingale, everyone knew to stay silent. When she chose the peacock, poetry would flow. Historians still debate how much of Mughal diplomacy was influenced by fragrance. While official records ignore the olfactory, diaries and travelers' journals suggest otherwise. One European visitor wrote of a banquet where every course was perfumed, every cushion dusted with fragrant powder, and the empress's hair glowed with the scent of 10,000 lillet. He confessed he remembered little of what was said. That night only the smell, which haunted him for weeks. And then there were the love stories. In Mughal romance, perfume was often the first act of seduction, before touch, before words. A concubine might prepare a handkerchief steeped in sandalwood and orange blossom, Place it under the emperor's pillow and wait. No need for confrontation. If he returned it, untouched, the answer was no. If he wore it the next day, tucked into his robe, the invitation was accepted. Entire affairs bloomed and died without a single word just sent, passed like secrets, but the stakes weren't always romantic. Political rivals used fragrance too. A poorly chosen blend could signal disdain. Too much civet, arrogance, too little scent, disrespect. There are rumors of perfume bottles laced with subtle poisons, of letters soaked in oils that caused hallucinations or nausea. One especially daring eunuch was accused of manipulating the emperor's moods by switching his message oils, using invigorating clove and ginger blends before royal councils he wanted to influence, and calming lavender when he needed him docile. There was no trial, just silence, and a quiet transfer to Kashmir. Yet for all this intrigue, there was also beauty. The act of perfume blending was intimate, meditative, a form of art reserved for the deeply trusted. Women in the harem held fragrance salons, sharing recipes, telling stories of their grandmother's love potions. They recorded scent memories the way others kept journals. One royal wife described her wedding night by listing the 6 fragrances worn in the room and how each one made her feel. Her final line reads, "I remember the smell more than the kiss." That's the kind of detail history rarely records, but never forgets. You lie still now, letting your own breath slow, and imagine being known not by your face or voice, but by scent. What would yours be? A bit of cardamom for clarity? A touch of rose for softness? A smoky base of oud for mystery? The Mughals believed that a person's soul could be expressed through scent, that even after death, a lingering fragrance meant the spirit had stayed a moment longer, a body gone, but a trace of them left behind. One last whisper. Shah Jahan, in his final days, blind and broken in Agra Fort, requested only one thing from his attendants, a vial of his wife's last perfume. Blend. Rose, saffron, and vetiver. He opened the bottle each evening and held it close, not to mourn, but to remember. Because sometimes, even an emperor can be comforted by something as simple, as invisible as scent. The lamp beside you flickers. Somewhere far in the garden, a jasmine branch exhales. And in that soft perfume of memory, the empire breathes once more. You're walking barefoot across a marble floor, chilled by monsoon air, and the only sound is your own breath echoing back at you, slower, deeper, as if the walls themselves are listening. On either side, corridors vanish into shadow, and at the end of this long hallway stands a door painted deep indigo, shipped just enough to whisper that it's been opened often, always in secret. You don't knock, you push. And inside, the warmth hits you like a velvet slap. Cushions spill across the floor, mirrors glint in every corner, and someone is laughing, not loudly, but the kind of laugh that tells you something wicked has just happened. This is not a royal chamber. This is not a harem. This is a Mughal love school. Yes, an actual space where desire was studied, rehearsed, and taught, like music or mathematics. Because in the twilight of the Mughal Empire, as politics frayed, and armies cracked, something strange was happening behind the scenes. Women were teaching each other how to love and how to survive doing it. Welcome to the Mohabbat Khana, or House of Affection, a term rarely found in official records, but passed down through oral lore, travelers' notes, and the occasional court scandal scribbled in the margins of a palace register. These were informal academies run by senior women of the Zenana, former courtesans, aging concubines, and widows too clever to be forgotten. They were not just places to gossip or embroider. They were schools for sex, for intimacy, for power, for understanding the fragile, beautiful chaos of the human heart, especially when it beat under silks and suspicion. Imagine this. A new concubine, barely 15, brought in from a distant province, terrified, illiterate, alone. She is not. Thrown into the emperor's bedchamber. She's brought here gently, with incense burning and sweet tea prepared to learn. Not just how to walk or speak, but how to listen. How to notice the tremble of a man's hand when he's hiding a secret. How to cool a temper with a fragrance. How to say no without ever using the word. How to say yes and mean it with more than just a nod. These were not lessons in obedience. They were lessons in survival. And the teachers? They were women like Gauhar Jana, former dancing girl from Lucknow, who had once been the mistress of a provincial governor and left him because he complained too often. She wore green silk, kept a pet mongoose, and spoke 5 languages, 2 of which she invented. Another, older matron named Bibishan taught mirror reading, a practice of deciphering body language through reflected glances. If your lover adjusted his turban before speaking, he was lying. If he smoothed the edge of his sash with both hands, he was trying not to beg. And if he touched his own wrist while talking? Desire, plain and simple. Science? Maybe not. But it worked often. Enough to be passed down through generations. Historians still argue whether these so-called love schools ever truly existed, or whether they were imagined after the fact by colonial writers enchanted by the exotic. But scattered evidence persists. A set of handwritten instructions for mixing. Love tonics, annotated in a feminine hand, preserved in a Delhi archive. A miniature painting of women gathered around an open manuscript, clearly not religious labeled only. Asterisk, evening instruction. And a diary of a Sufi mystic who wrote, I was once invited to a room where women taught each other how to touch the world without bruising it. I left dizzy. These schools weren't limited to erotic arts. They taught emotional resilience, how to read poetry with your eyes closed, how to control a room with your silence, how to make a man bag using only a pause. They taught not just how to please, but how to protect, how to reclaim pleasure when it was used as currency, and how to stay sane in a palace where desire could be deadly. One fringe tidbit? A Mughal princess known for her reclusive nature was said to have attended these sessions in secret, disguised as a handmaiden. Years later, when she negotiated her own marriage terms, including keeping her own estates and stipulating 3 nights a week of undisturbed reading, people wondered how she'd become so shrewd. The answer was whispered with a smirk, asterisk, she studied in the house of affection. Asterisk, and it wasn't all serious. There was laughter, music, even games. One popular exercise involved blindfolded perfume guessing, 1 drop of attar placed on the pulse point, the challenge to describe not just the scent, but the emotion it evoked. Another was role-play mock conversations with imagined suitors, where the goal wasn't to win, but to understand. One elder once said, you don't need to dominate him. You need to learn what dominates him. Power, in this space, was velvet-wrapped but razor-sharp. Not everyone approved. Aurangzeb's puritanical court issued a quiet ban on such gatherings. But they continued anyway, disguised as embroidery circles or musical practice. The knowledge passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, pillow to pillow. It was never written openly, but its effect shimmered in every confident step through the zenana, every well-timed glance across the banquet hall, every scandal that failed to be contained. You lie there now imagining these women laughing, whispering, stretching out across low cushions as they dissected emotions the way scholars parsed battle strategy. Not just teaching how to attract, but when to retreat. Not just how to kiss, but when to walk away. And maybe that's the real empire they built, not in marble or law, but in legacy. A secret curriculum passed in the gaps between histories. Official lines. Somewhere the door closes softly. The laughter fades, but the knowledge lingers. You exhale, and for just a moment, your breath smells faintly of saffron and smoke. You arrive now in a chamber that should no longer exist. The paint is peeling, the cushions long since eaten by time, but the bones of the place remain. Arched alcoves once lined with books, Lattice windows cut so finely they filter moonlight into lace, and a throne not grand or golden, but small, intimate, meant not for spectacle but for closeness. This is the last room of the empire's desire. Because here, in these fading walls, the Mughal world of seduction, strategy, perfume, poetry, and passion slowly unraveled, not with a scream, but with a sigh. You're standing in what used to be a private salon of Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor. A man who wrote love poetry while his empire collapsed, who sipped rose syrup as the British stormed his gates, who carried within him the haunted echoes of centuries of affection and appetite, and who died in exile, whispering verses into the humid silence of a foreign prison. And tonight, you watch that final candle burn low. Bahadur Shah Zafar wasn't supposed to rule. He was a reluctant poet prince, born into a world that already felt borrowed. The empire by then was fractured, its outer limbs amputated by East India Company treaties, its heart choked by bureaucracy and surveillance. But the inner world? The secret Mughal domain of emotion, elegance, and erotic knowledge, that still breathed. Zafar's court became a last refuge for those threads. Artists, dancers, philosophers, and courtesans all found shelter here, clinging to the dying beauty like petals refusing to fall. They didn't speak of resistance. They recited ghazals. They didn't raise weapons. They raised glasses. And in that soft rebellion of culture, they preserved something the British couldn't fully erase: the memory of how power once felt when it tasted of rose and sandalwood. Zafar himself was no great military mind, but he understood the heart. He understood the way longing moved through a room. He fell in love often with dancers, poets, noblewomen, even one Persian singer who claimed to have dreamt of him years before they met. One of his most enduring companions was Zeenat Mahal, a woman 20 years his junior, who wielded court politics with the same ease she poured tea. Historians still argue whether she truly loved him or simply saw an opportunity to shape the endgame. But even in that uncertainty, you find something honest. Because theirs was a love forged not in power but in the ruins of it. One surviving letter from Zafar to Zeenat reads, "You are the scent on my pillow even when your body is gone." What is that, if not proof of God? That kind of writing doesn't come from strategy. It comes from a man who knows he's losing everything, but still wants to taste the beauty as it slips away. Even in his weakest moments, under house arrest, betrayed by allies, humiliated by British officers, Zafar insisted on lighting incense, reciting poetry aloud, and dressing in embroidered robes, not out of vanity, but defiance. If they would take his empire, they would not take the dignity of how he moved through loss. And what of the harem in those final days? It no longer pulsed with the energy of seduction. It became a sanctuary of memory. The older women recited stories of Nur Jahan and Jahanara. The younger ones sang lullabies they barely understood. The perfumes ran out, the silk faded. But the knowledge, the quiet knowledge of how to hold power in a smile, how to move through rooms like a question instead of an answer, that still lived. One fringe detail: British soldiers who entered the Red Fort during the rebellion found verses etched into the walls of the women's quarters, fragments of lost ghazals, names carved alongside stars, even a poem scrawled on a mirror in soot that read, "If I am to be erased, let it be with beauty." You lie there now, breathing slowly, as the last scent of the empire curls around you. It smells of memory, of sandalwood and saffron, and something else, perhaps grief, perhaps survival. You realize the Mughal legacy wasn't just palaces or monuments. It was the way desire was dignified, the way intelligence and intimacy were never opposites, the way women taught each other how to live in impossible spaces and still find music, the way emperors could cry over a poem and still command armies. It was the belief that power didn't have to roar. It could hum. And tonight, in this story, it has. You close your eyes, and in that moment, The ghost of Zafar leans over your shoulder and whispers the final couplet he wrote before he died. In a cell far from Delhi, asterisk, kitna hai badnasib Zafar. Dafn kelai, duga zaman bi na mili ku yarmain. Asterisk, how unlucky is Zafar. For burial, not even 2 yards of land in his beloved city. And yet, you hear him still, in the rhythm of verses. In the warmth of desire passed down like heirloom silk. In the hush of women's voices behind palace screens. The empire has fallen. But it lingers in the air. And now, the stories soften. The candles gutter low, the court quiets. The marbled halls of memory dim to dusk. You've walked through centuries tonight, through gardens of forbidden touch and chambers of whispered names. You've sat beside queens who wielded silence like daggers and emperors who mistook love for immortality. You've inhaled the secrets of women who were never named in textbooks, but who rewrote the rules of power with a glance, a poem, a scent. And now, as the world outside your window settles into its slower rhythm, so do you. There's no more war to win, no more throne to seize, no more lover to impress. Just you and breath, and the soft echo of silk dragging across marble one last time. Picture the moonlight resting on an empty courtyard, a single jasmine blossom drifting from a branch above, the hush of 1,000 untold stories settling quietly into sleep. Let the edges of your mind blur. Let the histories soften into dreams. And if you find yourself wandering in your sleep tonight, walking through mirrored halls, or hearing footsteps that leave no mark, just know that you are safe, that the empire of longing is eternal, that you've been here before and you'll return again. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.